that was my real first exposure to what's called big data. They had a player, Charlie Adam, who would just shoot from anywhere, and it drove me crazy. It's the kind of shot that has almost completely disappeared from football now because of
Mm.
expected goals. I told him what I wanted to do, and he said, well, that's great. Like, everybody wants to break into the industry. Like, you really have to show clubs what you could do. And so that was the inspiration. We get like 700 to 1,000 applications for every job that we've posted, which is really hard to go through. The Oakland Athletics last season lost over 100 games, and they have at least 15 people working on data analytics, which is like more than any football club in the world. I was just absolutely blown away at like the detail and understanding of the game that everyone on staff had. Scouts are basically data generators,
Yeah.
but people don't treat them that way. So to be a successful person within football analytics, I think you really need to come up with things that.
Hello and welcome back to the Gill podcast, and today's guest is Sarah Rudd. So Sarah actually started her career working at Microsoft, but then made the transition over to football analytics. So that pivot started when Sarah got a job with StatDNA, which was eventually then brought in-house into Arsenal Football Club. So Sarah spent almost 10 years working at Arsenal, and then after that there was time spent working within a multi-club ownership group, but then more recently Sarah has since co-founded her own sports analytics company, Source Football. So Sarah is very well respected within the football analytics community, speaking at various different events. So I'm very pleased to have Sarah on the podcast, and it was great to chat with her around her journey and all around football analytics. Okay, so before we get into the conversation, I want to quickly ask you to subscribe to the channel if you haven't already done so, and consider giving the video a like if you do find value. So it really does help the channel to grow. It doesn't cost you anything, so it would be very much appreciated. So let's get into the conversation with Sarah Rudd. Sarah, welcome to the podcast. How are you doing today?
Doing well, thank you. Thanks for having me on.
No, I'm really looking forward to speaking with you, Sarah. Obviously, from your accent there, I can tell you're joining us from the US. So I think a lot of people interested in sports analysis, sports analytics will probably know who you are. But for those that don't, Sarah, I'd like to pass it straight over to you just to give a quick introduction of who you are and what's led you to where you are today.
Yeah, I mean, so I started out, not ever really imagining having a career in sport, even though football is something that I've been obsessed with since I was, a little girl. So yeah, I mean, was working at Microsoft as a software developer, and just really trying to think about, how I can transition over to a career in football. Even though I had never really played at a high level, nobody in my family like really was that interested in sport. And so, I just kind of through chance met a couple people that were talking about, oh, can you do Moneyball in football? Like, is that even possible? And so that got me kind of thinking about it. So just tried to get my hands on as much data as possible, and was fortunate to meet up with some people from a company called StatDNA, and they had a research competition where they let you have data and you could do fun things with it. So I wrote sort of one of the early kind of modern papers on valuing actions within a football match. I don't even remember the title of it, but it was something super nerdy and overly complex. But I think the concept has been popularized by Karun Singh with his expected threat model. So different implementations, but similar idea of just, how much value can a player create moving the ball from here to there, or vice versa. And so that's kind of how I got my start in the industry, or got my name out there. And then, the folks at StatDNA liked it enough that they brought me on board, and within a year or so, we were acquired by Arsenal. So we were Arsenal's in-house analytics department. It's now been rebranded to Arsenal Data Analysis, but that's still very much alive at the club. And I left the club July of 2021. Had a brief stint at a multi-club ownership group that wasn't really just a good fit on a number of levels, and from there founded my own company called Source Football. So we're a football analytics consultancy group, really helping clubs get started on this journey, and helping them get ramped up and up to speed on this.
Amazing, perfect. So you mentioned just right at the start, so you said you kind of had a passion for football anyway. You played a little bit as a youngster, but you were then at Microsoft. So I'm just curious to ask you, anything that you did at Microsoft, was that translatable to what you're currently doing now? What were you actually doing there, and did you take anything from there in terms of the skill set you were doing?
Yeah, I mean, so kind of like the weirdest way is that, so I was working in a group called Bing. which is Microsoft's, search engine. So that was my real first exposure to what's called big data.
Mm.
And so I laugh because in Spain, anything to do with like football analytics is called big data, even though in terms of like the tech industry, like they would laugh at how small football data actually is. But we were using our own implementation of a technology called Spark. I mean, it was more kind of like a MapReduce type thing. And sorry, this is getting quite nerdy, but like a lot of the underlying principles that we're using back then to analyze some of the query logs for Bing is very applicable to tracking data in football. So like, it took a while. Like it wasn't like I walked in the door at Arsenal and it's like, oh, here's tracking data. Like we didn't have it for a number of years, but once we got it, it was like, oh, like, hey, I'm really familiar with this type of technology that we can use to kind of store and analyze this data. So that was something that was really applicable. Just in terms of like working across multiple disciplinary teams,
Mm.
was really good. I mean, Microsoft is like a behemoth of an organization. So in terms of like navigating departmental politics, that made it, I guess, a little bit easier sometimes. And then another weird one is interviewing. At Microsoft, I learned kind of the beginnings of how to interview people, and
Yeah.
a lot of how we interviewed people there I liked, and also I didn't like. And I think that's something that over the course of my career I've gotten quite good at.
Mm.
And it's a unbelievably valuable skill in football. And I think far too often a lot of these roles at football clubs get filled based on who you know, and that's a huge disadvantage to football clubs. So I think that's a way
Yeah.
that Microsoft has really helped me.
Yeah, definitely. So I will come back to that later because when we kind of touch on advice, I want to ask you about kind of the hiring process and what you maybe look for in an analyst, Sarah. But you did say there about the kind of the way you kind of broke in terms of that conference, the StatDNA. You kind of doing that initial paper on was so that was around kind of the expected throw, the mark of change. Again, I told you before we started recording, I'm
Yeah,
no expert on this. So
yeah,
because I did an episode a few back with David Sumter, and he actually mentioned your name. He said obviously the original work from Sarah in terms of you are then moved on to Arsenal. So can you just tell us a little bit more about what that kind of, because that was, what was that, 2011? That was kind of 12,
yeah,
13,
I think
whatever,
so.
many years ago. So I don't know how much you remember of that, but just in terms of what that was about and kind of, can you break it down a little bit in a bit more detail?
Yeah, I mean, so the whole thing was kind of inspired. So my great grandfather was a Blackpool fan, and then kind of in my family, the passion for football died for a couple generations until I came along. So the year that Blackpool were in the Premiership, I obviously had a liking for them, even though they weren't maybe the most fun team to watch. But they had a player, Charlie Adam, who would just shoot from anywhere, and it drove me crazy. Like it's the kind of shot that has almost completely disappeared from football now because of
Mm.
expected goals. But he would have a crack at it from like 40, 45 yards and just kind of kill whatever possession they had. And they really didn't have much possession. So, it was hard for me to watch. But that kind of inspired me to think about, well, what were his options? What could he have done with the ball? And this is before tracking data, so we couldn't really analyze exactly what were the receiver options. But I thought, what are some ways that we can kind of estimate if he's in this location? Um, what's the probability that he could have moved the ball to a different location that was maybe more valuable than what he did choose, which was taking a shot, which had very, very little value. And so the really nice thing is that StatDNA had a lot of additional contextual factors around their data that other data providers at the time didn't really have. And
Mm.
so that allowed you to kind of distinguish certain types of situations. So you could kind of understand like, oh, have they broken a midfield line? Is it kind of like more easy to push the ball forward than kind of facing a low block? And so really what we did, or what I did, was create what's called states. And all a Markov chain is kind of having these states and then figuring out the probability of moving from one state to another. So you could think of a state as sort of like a pitch location plus defensive contextual factors, and saying like, okay, well, if we're in behind the defensive line close to goal, like how likely are you to score from there versus maybe out wide with like a really settled defense. So that was kind of the crux of the paper. And yeah, obviously it has huge implications on evaluating a player's, passing ability, decision-making ability. There's loads of applications to it. So, I think that wouldn't have been possible, and people have tried to replicate it without the StatDNA contextual factors, but it's a lot easier to do if you know a little bit more about what's happening in the game.
Yeah, I didn't expect you to bring up Blackpool for that's definitely a certain. But yeah, Charlie Adam obviously he scored from the halfway line maybe once or twice. I remember the goal. So in terms of that, I'm sure that the kind of work that you did back then is kind of being built upon maybe by yourself from then to now, maybe others. So how has that come from 13 years ago, the work you did then? Has it been built upon in terms of what has been added to it? How has it become more mainstream now potentially?
Yeah, I mean, like the irony is that everyone thinks, oh, like StatDNA was so lucky to hire you. Like, they could then bring your model in there. But I was just shocked at like how much they'd actually done before I even got in the door. So
Mm.
that model actually never ended up getting really used. They had their own model that worked a little bit better. I mean, I can talk about a lot of the shortcomings of that original paper. But like it's a concept that it has definitely been built upon. And when you look at some of the, I guess, like more modern tracking data papers out there, there's a whole host that have been done by Javi Fernandez and Luke Bourne looking at like an EPV model. That's kind of like the next logical step to kind
Mm.
of say like, well, we want to take this concept of valuing ball movement, but we have much richer data, so we can use much
Yeah.
more advanced techniques on it. Things like that, which is cool. And yeah, I mean, just in terms of my career, how much football analytics has grown since that paper came out. I mean, I always waffle between we've learned so much and the other side is we still know nothing. I mean, football is
Yeah.
such a complex sport. But yeah, I mean, I think we really have learned a lot. And in learning, so we, I guess, realized how much further we still have to go.
Mm, definitely. So back when you maybe before you were at StatDNA, then in terms of kind of breaking into football, at least trying to, Sarah, were you one that had a personal blog? Were you posting online? Were you doing that like others were at the time?
Yeah, yeah. I think I was probably one of the earlier bloggers.
Mm.
But basically, what happened was I had somehow found out about the MIT Sloan Sports Analytics Conference, and I spoke with one of the panelists at the time because it was the first football analytics panel, but it was American football and
Yeah.
proper football. So we got like half a panel. But I spoke with one of the panelists. His name was Mike Ford. And, I told him what I wanted to do. And he said, well, that's great. Like everybody wants to break into the industry. Like you really have to show clubs what you could do. And so that was the inspiration
Mm.
for the blog. And honestly, part of it was, trying to showcase what I could do. Part of it was really just like me learning, but in like a very public space. So just trying to do whatever I could with the data I could get my hands on, and just throwing it out there. And I think there were a number of early blogs out there like Chris Anderson, Howard Hamilton, Zach Slayton. We all kind of started around the same time, and we even had like a blog aggregator, which sounds so dated now, called like Soccer Analysts. I think
Yeah.
we were all on there, kind of like sharing and promoting each other's work.
Yeah. Cool. So, do you still keep up with what's kind of going on online in terms of modern like blogs nowadays and on Twitter? Are you still kind of keeping a kind of eye on what's kind of out there now, Sarah?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think what's kind of amazing compared to like when I was getting started versus people now is that they have so much more access to data and they don't have to kind of solve the really easy things. Like there's just so much more kind of like knowledge out there that they can build upon really quickly. So, somebody who's maybe only been interested in football analytics for a year can be doing like really high level stuff, which is pretty amazing. So yeah, I try to keep abreast of it. Unfortunately, Twitter used to be my go-to source, and it's just a nightmare now to find anything. So
Yeah.
it is a little bit harder, but there's loads of good conferences out there where they're highlighting really, really good research. So that's been great. Things like it's now the Stats Perform Forum, Stats Bomb. I'm helping organize a conference in the States beginning of next year called the American Soccer Insights Summit. Hopefully we'll have some good research there to highlight as well. But yeah, I mean, for people either working outside of a club or inside of a club, keeping abreast of what's going on is just crucial because like you don't want to go too far down an echo chamber. Like there's loads of good ideas out there, and it's also a great way to find talent that you might want to hire.
Yeah. Okay, so I hope you're enjoying the video so far, but I have a really quick interruption for anybody with an interest in video analysis. So if that's you, please do click the link down below the video for In-Play Online. So just to give a quick overview, because I think it'll be relevant to a lot of people that are watching this particular video. So In-Play Online is a cloud-based video analysis software. So it allows you to tag your videos, and when you've done your tagging, that includes adding labels, adding comments, adding notes and voice notes even, and you can even illustrate and draw over your clip. So if you are an aspiring analyst looking for your job and you want to create a portfolio of work, if you're a scout looking to make your kind of reports a little bit better and more animated, if you're a coach looking to get into analysis a little bit more, then this tool will be great for you because it starts at just £15 a month. So once you've done your analysis, you can add all the clips to different playlists which can be downloaded and exported offline. You can put them into presentations and also share them to different people within your team. So it comes with a whole bunch of other features, but I'll let you click the link down below if you are interested. As I say, packages start at just £15 a month, so it's a very affordable solution if you are looking for something to help with your video analysis. So that's it for the interruption. Let's get back to the video. You mentioned it there. I had it down to mention later, but we might as well talk about it now. So the American Soccer Insight Summit, which was only recently announced to kind of something that's happening early next year. So for those that may not have seen it, I will link it below the video, but can you share, I know it's early days, so you might not kind of have the full plan or anything like that, but can you share anything else on that, Sarah? Maybe some ideas that you have, also just the reason of starting it, basically.
Yeah, I mean, so it's an idea that was actually brought to me by some of the people at Rice University. So for those that don't know, Rice is an incredible university here in Houston, Texas, and they recently started a sports analytics major. So prior to that, they had sports management, but now within the sports management department, they also have sports analytics. And Houston is obviously known for being, quite a good sports city in the U.S. And so they really wanted to differentiate themselves because there are like a number of kind of like university sponsored sports analytics conferences. And they said, let's focus on one sport and really go all in on it and become kind of the premier kind of American soccer conference. And so I obviously love that idea. So myself, Ravi Ramaneni, Sam Gregory, were kind of some of the outside people. I guess Jasmine Jones as well from Houston Dynamo and Dash, kind of people outside of Rice University that are helping with it. But then you have people within the university like Scott Powers, who's worked in baseball, but also works with Zealous, has some background in soccer as well. So it's a great group of people helping to organize the conference. And some of our goals are to highlight work of students to help them land jobs in the industry. But also to be a place where people from Major League Soccer and NWSL can kind of meet and share ideas. And then we really want to kind of highlight some fresh voices in the industry. I think at some of these conferences, you get the same people speaking over and over again. I obviously get invited to speak at a lot of these. And so I like being part of the organizing committee to kind of like take a step back and say, like, let's let some of the fresher voices out there speak. So we're going to try to do a couple, I wouldn't say like innovative, but like less common things in terms of the format, really focusing a little bit on the application of analytics. So not just, hey, here's a cool model I built, but hey, this is how I'm influencing the decision-making process. Because yeah, at the end of the day, like that's what really matters, is getting your stuff actually onto the pitch.
Yeah, cool. Yeah, so because I said I'll mention I'll link it down below because I think there's a questionnaire where you're trying to obviously get people's thoughts on what they want to see and what they want to be included. So that's pretty good. So if anyone has an interest, definitely check that out. So just on that kind of topic of maybe not just Twitter analytics, but that online kind of blogging and stuff like that. Obviously, you've kind of gone from that into football and back out again, Sarah. But in terms of back out by leaving the club, I meant. But in terms of what do you see as the main kind of differences between, because obviously a lot of these people that are posting on Twitter, on LinkedIn, on the blogs, their end goal is to work within a football club. Well, not all of them, but some of them will want to do that. So From you being from both sides, really, what differences do you see? Like when you went from being outside of a club into Arsenal, was it a shock for you? Was it different in terms of what they're doing? Is it completely different? Is it more similar than people might think? Just trying to gauge what the differences are, really.
Yeah, I mean, one of the big shocks for me going from outside to inside Arsenal, I mean, so Arsenal didn't really have much of a analytics department, so that's why we were brought in. But I was just absolutely blown away at like the detail and understanding of the game that everyone on staff had. I think at the time I thought I really understood the game, and like
Yeah,
now there's like three levels deeper that you need to go to really have a conversation with these types of people. And so I think that's something that, yeah, I think people trying to get their foot in the door really need to understand is that, I think it comes down, or to take a step back, like to be a successful person within football analytics, I think you really need to come up with things that match what people are seeing on the pitch. I think there's this temptation sometimes to come up with things that are maybe like a little bit counterintuitive, or sometimes it's hard to kind of verify exactly what you're doing. Too many things are kind of taken with a grain of salt. But what you really want to do is come up with models that you can take them to a coach or to a head of recruitment and say, look, this is how it works. I'm going to show you the video. This is how it all flows. And to me, that's how you really build trust. And in order to be able to do that, you have to have like this deep understanding of, oh, did I take into account all of these contextual factors? Does it hold up in this situation? Does it hold up in that situation? And I think, sometimes some of the stuff happening in the public sphere is maybe a little bit oversimplified, which, isn't going to prevent me from hiring somebody. Like, I understand that like you're doing this in your spare time. You don't have as much time, but like I think also that needs to be acknowledged somewhere, saying, if I had more time, I would have taken this into account. But,
yeah,
you know, I only have 10 games of tracking data, or,
yeah,
sorry, I have a full-time job. I can't, devote 60 hours a week to this like the professionals. So,
yeah,
I think that's one of the big differences. I think the other one is, um, a lot of times when you're working in a football club, the ways that you can add value are really kind of obvious and known and discussed, whether it's coming like a direct request coming from somebody, or whether, it's kind of like, oh, this is how we can add value. Whereas I think still on the outside, there's a lot of people that aren't necessarily putting themselves into the place of like, if I was a sporting director, what
yeah,
would I want to know? If I was head of recruitment, what would I want to know? And I think shifting um, that mentality is really important, because those are the types of projects that are going to get you most noticed. Is, oh, I saw this would really be helpful to me, rather than this is cool, or look at this kind of like
yeah.
really complex model that I've built that doesn't really solve a problem.
Yeah, yeah, definitely. So, obviously, going from the outside in, then it kind of that's where the level of secrecy comes in. You know, we understand that clubs don't want to share their secrets. It's kind of once it's in house, kind of, and it seems like I think people will understand that, but I think from a perspective of the community and always better in the analytics space, it would probably be a good idea to share these things. So, just curious to get your thoughts on that, Sarah, in terms of the balance between being secret in terms of within the clubs, but still having that kind of open dialogue with other analysts and other people within the space.
Yeah, I think it's really hard. And I think when I was at Arsenal, we were definitely too far to the secretive
Mm.
extreme, where, they didn't really like anybody speaking publicly about what we were doing. It was seen as kind of like giving away um, our competitive advantage. There's also kind of, I think, like a very uh, reasonable philosophy of like, well, if everybody has like reasonably good analytics, then the team with the most money is just gonna
Mm.
be successful. And we kind of see that anyway. And so like, the only way that an Arsenal can compete with the city is to kind of not reveal as much
Yeah,
as possible. But yeah, but like from the human element, from like the I guess like the good of the industry, I think there does need to be some more openness. And again, what I was kind of alluding to before, where, I think what I see out there from a lot of clubs that we go visit now is that the stuff just isn't really having the impact it should, because it's not necessarily sitting well with the decision makers in terms of, does this match what I'm seeing with my eyes to the point that I can trust it, I can make decisions on. And I think if people were a little bit more open,
Mm.
they would share a little bit more of like, how do I get it to that level that it needs to be? And so this has kind of impact on the industry because, if I were a sporting director and I saw things that I wasn't necessarily like 100% convinced with, didn't want to necessarily make decisions on, I'm not going to give you then the budget to go hire two, three more people, even
Yeah.
though that's probably what you need to get it to the right level.
Yeah.
And so that, yeah, it just has these ramifications on the industry where like without people being more collaborative, more open, sharing, um, it's not really getting the buy-in or the impact that you see in other sports. And then because it's not having that impact, there's not the development to really kick it on to the next level. And
Yeah.
so we're just in this like vicious cycle of yeah, not really making as much progress as we should.
Yeah, I mean, it's obviously come a long way since then. But my background is more in kind of video analysis. So, like, I'm just thinking way back when, it was even hard to share, get hold of video back then in terms of from different
Yeah.
teams. Like now, it's obviously all shared and everyone gets every video. But back then, you had to do a favor for another analyst to get the video. So it's obviously come a long way since then. So, but like you say, there's still way to go as well to kind of keep sharing and keep kind of innovating as well. So you mentioned obviously we've talked a little bit about Arsenal in terms of they kind of they bought StatDNA, didn't they? They purchased them and
Yeah.
brought them in house. So were you based there, or were you based still in the US? How did it work, and how many people were in the StatDNA team at that point?
Yeah, I think when we were bought, we might have been like five or six, so pretty small team.
Mm,
And then at the maximum, I think it was 15 people.
okay.
And so most of us were based in the US. Over time, we then started having people full time at London Colney. And, there's a number of pros and cons to being remote. We say this almost every day in our company, but training grounds are like some of the worst places to do work. They're just not at all conducive to the type of work that we really do, which requires like deep thought and a lot of concentration. I mean, it's a place buzzing with energy and people moving about and having conversations, but yeah, it's hard to really get a lot of work done there. And so being remote allowed us to have a little bit more space to kind of do that type of thinking. It also prevented us or like reduced the impact of groupthink.
Mm,
A lot of times when you're kind of doing like a team performance review, that can be heavily influenced by the coaching staff and what they're kind of like seeing and worried about. And I have this phrase that I picked up. It's called majoring the minor, where a lot of times people will kind of make a really big deal out of something that's really maybe a little bit inconsequential. And we see that a lot with coaching staffs where there might be something that they've been working on in training hasn't really worked the way that they wanted. And so that's like the reason that the team is struggling, and they might be missing like something that's
yeah.
just like really, really obvious. So having that kind of separation to avoid that, I think was a little bit beneficial. I mean, the downside is obviously you don't have those personal relationships. You're not part of every single conversation. But yeah, I guess that's a long way of answering. Like, yeah, we were
Yeah.
mostly remote the whole time.
Cool. So obviously that was because Arsenal didn't really have at the time. You mentioned that was their data analyst department. But in terms of other staff that were within the club that you would kind of integrate with, in terms of like the scouting department, which was I'm presuming was in place at the time, and then like the performance analyst, or like the more video analyst, did you integrate with them, and how did that work, and how did that look?
Yeah, I mean, so each person within StatDNA, so as we kind of grew, we would have various different touch points so that it wasn't, everybody talking
Mm,
to everybody. But yeah, certainly, I mean, huge touch points with scouting and recruitment and sporting director, very good close relationship with the performance analysis department, and not just with the first team, but down through the academy as well. So doing a lot of work kind of with the coaching staffs at all the different levels through Arsenal Football Club. Yeah, I mean, we even forayed into the high performance department, medical department, until they started having so many questions that it's like, okay, well, you guys need somebody dedicated on site that can answer this because those are the types of people that are just so used to having numbers, very comfortable with it, and so they had loads and loads of questions. But yeah, I mean, uh, for better or worse, we were basically involved in kind of any department that had kind of data driven questions.
Yeah, and did that the focus change over the time you were there, Sarah, in terms of maybe was it more recruitment when you started and then it added more in terms of post pre-match, or was it always a mix of everything, or did one kind of take a bit of precedent over the other in terms of resources?
Yeah, I mean, it's always been a bit of a mix of everything. Compared to a lot of analytics departments, we were very, very well staffed. So I think there was a lot of ambition to kind of try to help as many people as possible. Um, but then, certainly as kind of the decision-making hierarchy of the club changed, like how much we invested in each
Yeah,
aspect kind of changed. So, there was a period in the club where we weren't having as much influence over recruitment as we would have wanted. And so that's when we kind of shifted to academy.
yeah,
And, that was an area where they were much more kind of receptive to the type of work we could do. And it's, paid huge, huge dividends.
yeah, cool. So what I want to ask you about, Sarah, is kind of collecting data in general, and I refer firstly back to I watched it before you joined in terms of your talk at the StatsBomb conference, which is 2022. In terms of you got on your stage, you delivered a bit about this. So first question is about kind of you mentioned it in terms of the conference that you guys are organising. You obviously have done a lot of these talks and stuff like that. So just a question around them in terms of are the benefit of them for kind of networking, because I know a lot of people will go to them just as guests and kind of, but maybe as, can you give any advice for people to kind of make the most of those kind of events really?
Yeah, I mean, I think absolutely the value is in networking, and certainly during COVID when a lot of things went online, we missed that quite a bit. And some of the feedback that I've gotten from people kind of trying to get into the industry now, certainly people from kind of underrepresented backgrounds, is that it can actually be really intimidating walking into a room full of kind of like white men that
Mm,
all know each other,
yeah.
and trying to network. So my advice would be try to set up as many meetings with people ahead of time,
Mm,
reaching out to them via LinkedIn or Twitter and just trying to say like, hey, can I grab a second of your time? And hopefully that makes it a little bit easier to approach them. But then also, I'm going to throw this back onto the event organizers, like try to have some kind of like social networking events with some structure around them so that people who are new to the industry, or trying to get in that are the diversity that we all want and crave, like set up situations where they do feel included, they don't feel like such an outsider. Because I mean, it's not fun walking into a room of 500
yeah.
men that don't think you, or some of them probably don't think you should be there anyway. So
Yeah.
um, one of the things we're going to do at our conference is just have a little meetup the night before for women,
Mm,
so that any woman who's attending the conference hopefully shows up the next day knowing at least one other person.
yeah.
We'll see if that's successful. I don't know,
Yeah.
but the inspiration for that is that the second time I went to the Sloan Sports Analytics Conference, we decided to just have a meetup and announce it on Twitter. And like, I met so many people that way, so many people I'm still in touch with. So, hopefully this will make a small impact.
Cool. Nice. I think I was trying to work it out before you, John. I think you're number five in terms of women on the show so far. I'm trying to get more, Sarah, but that's number five so far.
That's
Hopefully
that's
that
higher
grows.
than I would have thought. Yeah.
Yeah, 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 definitely. So there's definitely an underrepresented, and I would imagine the feeling of walking in and being a 1% in the room of all the different people. So yeah, I mean, it sounds like you've kind of got ideas in place to kind of implement that into your conference. So in terms of that kind of the generating data talk, then Sarah, can you just kind of talk a little bit more around? I will link it down below for people that want to watch the full thing. I don't know, and again, it's a while back, so you might have not exactly know exactly what you spoke about, but if you can just kind of go a little bit more into that in terms of different types of data and how people can potentially collect their own data and things to consider? Because I know I think
Yeah,
you mentioned kind of collecting and generating as well. So just the differences and what you meant by that.
yeah, I mean, this is something that I'm super passionate about. I think a lot of it is driven from, yeah, my first job at football was StatDNA, which was like a data collection company, but also doing the analytics on top of it. And our competitive advantage, as I mentioned, was having additional contextual factors with the data. So, the whole reason we were purchased is that Ivan Gazidis and Hendrik Olmsted said, if we have better data than people, this is going to be a competitive advantage. We don't want other clubs having this. Let's buy them and bring them in. And so that's kind of an ethos that I carry with me to this day, whereas, better data is a competitive advantage. And, so not everybody has the resources to go and create their own data collection company, but I think there are, clever ways that you can collect data. Everyone who's familiar with the event data in football knows that it's limited. So I think there's ways that you can kind of figure out, what is it missing? Is there a structured way that I can kind of think about how do I want to collect this? And then, maybe it's not something that you're going to collect for every player in the world, but you can, be quite deliberate about what are the leagues I want to cover? Is this something that maybe we only want for our team? Or, my personal favorite is this something that we can collect as a training set for a machine learning model, which I think is a really underutilized technique. But, for those that aren't that familiar with machine learning, there's usually two types of modeling. One is called supervised, where you give it a set of labels and then it tries to figure out what those labels are. And then there's unsupervised, which is you kind of say, like, go figure it out. So one of the most common unsupervised types of models is like clustering. So you say, hey, I'm going to give you all the players in the world. You cluster them into the different player types, and then I'll assign maybe a label to them. So that's one way of doing it. The flip side of that would be I'm going to label what each type of player is, and then write a model that's going to predict what those players are. So I think that's super powerful, and it isn't really utilized as much as possible or much as it should be, just because it's kind of the unsexy type of manual labor, but it makes life so much easier. Supervised models are just way easier to build than unsupervised. And the other big piece I think of data generation or data collection is scouts. Scouts are basically data generators,
Yeah.
but people don't treat them that way. So no data collection company is ever going to say, "Go generate some data," but I'm not going to tell you what type of data, what structure, what the scale is, anything like that. But for some reason, clubs are totally fine doing that with their scout. I don't see nearly enough kind of education on this is what a scouting report for this club should look like. This is what,
Yeah.
this rating means. This is how we're rating potential versus current. This is how we're assessing, squint fit into the squad
Yeah.
versus, just general quality. And I think that's just such a missed opportunity for football clubs.
Okay, so if you've made it this far into the video, you must be enjoying the content. Either that or you have simply fallen asleep. So whichever one of them it is, you probably won't mind me asking you for a quick favour. So as you know, I'm always looking to grow the channel. So the bigger the channel gets, the more people we can reach and impact, but also the bigger and better guests we can invite onto the channel to have these types of chats. So with that in mind, if you haven't already done so, I would very much appreciate it if you did hit the subscribe button down below the video. The stats are showing around 25% of viewers are subscribed, so there's a big chunk of you that are watching the videos but you haven't yet hit the subscribe button, but I will let you off because you can do it right now. It's free and it literally takes 1 second. So if you go down, click the subscribe button, it would mean a lot to the channel and help the channel to grow. So that's all for now. Let's get back to the video. Definitely. So, because I think in the talk you mentioned the FIFA football language, which again, something else I will link down below. I had Chris Loxton on, who was at FIFA at the time for that, and he kind of spoke around that, and I found that really interesting, because I think in that there was kind of stuff about kind of off the ball runs and things like that. So I don't know, in terms of what's your thoughts on kind of data around off the ball things, Sarah, rather than just on the ball.
Yeah, I mean, when we talk about event data, what's the big shortcoming? It doesn't capture anything off the
Mm,
ball. So, this is exactly the type of thing I'm talking about is we need to capture this. And so, there's kind of two things. One, you could have somebody watching all the games and kind of saying, okay, this is what this player is doing off the ball, which I think is, what the FA does quite a lot of. Or, now that we have wonderful things like Skill Corner, which is kind of enabling clubs to have much broader access to tracking data.
mm.
You can have someone do that for a handful of games and then build a model that says, okay, now I'm going to pick up all the different types of off-ball runs that I've just given you. So that would be an example of like a supervised machine learning model that just needs some data collected to get that going.
Yeah, perfect. And then what would you say, Sarah, in terms of someone we're going down the kind of to the more basic here, in terms of people that aren't in a club and they want to do their own projects, where do you have any go-tos of where and how they can get their own data, like a data set, like where can people get this for affordable price or for free basically to start off doing their own thing?
Yeah, I think now, I mean, I have to sing StatsBomb's praises. They've done a great job trying to help people out with this. So StatsBomb is constantly releasing new data sets for people to get their hands on.
Mm,
So, definitely start with the event data. StatsBomb has made it really easy. I can't remember what the URL is. You can probably link to
yeah,
that as well.
yeah.
But yeah, they have loads of free data. Like I think they just released every single Bayer Leverkusen match for this season. So it's like, well,
Mm,
you know, go study one of the most interesting teams we've seen in a while.
yeah.
So that's really great. I do believe Skill Corner also has some open data. It's not, I think, as comprehensive as what StatsBomb offers, but it's also a little bit harder to use. But I would say, yeah, definitely get started with StatsBomb, and then if you feel ambitious, go with the Skill Corner.
Yeah, cool. So I want to ask you then, in terms of the different sports, obviously you're based in the US, there's some big sports over there, obviously American football, basketball, which are quite well known to be quite ahead in terms of analytics. So what would you say, or can you judge which sport is maybe ahead of is there a kind of a ranking system which would you say is more advanced than others when it comes to sports analytics?
Yeah, I mean, baseball is definitely the North Star, and there's a number of reasons for that. I mean, they get to play 162 matches, just so many different matchups. Like football, as much as we'd love to say, like, yeah, one day we're gonna really solve this, like we're never gonna get over the problem that there's like 38 matches in a domestic league, one home, one away.
Yeah.
Um, you know, there's just not enough matches. And when you get down to women's football, it's even worse.
Mm.
The
Yeah.
women's game just isn't really playing enough matches for like data analytics to have as much impact as we would like. But yeah, baseball, I mean, it's so much easier. Like we look at it and we're like, oh my God, what a easy sport. But they also invest so much more. So I think the example that I've been using is the Oakland Athletics last season lost over 100 games, and they have at least 15 people working on data analytics, which is like more than any football club in the world.
Mm.
Um, so that's the level of an investment that they're requiring to lose 100 matches. So, the clubs that are actually winning 100 matches, they're at the like 30,
Yeah.
40. And, it's not just modelers, but, they have complete software platforms and all sorts of things like this so that, any information that a decision maker wants at any point in time, they can just bring it up and they have it. And they do a whole lot in terms of like education so that they know that the person making that decision, seeing that information, knows exactly what it means, which I think in football, we maybe don't do as good of a job in that. So yeah, I mean, football is obviously never going to be baseball. But I think, in terms of the other American sports, it's really taking off in American football, where there's a much more level of investment there. And I think there's just like a more, I guess, like openness in the culture because you look at baseball, that every single successful team is using analytics, whereas I think in our football, there's still teams that aren't using analytics that are successful. And so I think that leads to a little bit more hesitancy. And again, it comes back to this problem of like the work that's being done inside clubs, isn't necessarily convincing enough that they're going to risk their jobs on it, so they would invest, and
Yeah, yeah,
then they
yeah.
don't hire more people. But yeah, I mean, we're definitely a lot further ahead than we were when I got started. So it's not all doom and gloom, but until we can figure out how to kind of clone these guys and get them to play, 5 times a week, I think it's going to
Yeah.
be difficult.
So, if somebody said, right, Sarah, you can work in sports analytics, but you can't work in football anymore, which sport would you want to go to as the next kind of career move?
Might be basketball,
Okay.
or maybe cricket. I don't know.
Yeah.
My husband is Indian, so he's gotten me pretty into cricket. The U.S. obviously just had an amazing win over Pakistan a couple days ago, so I think it's pretty interesting. But um, yeah, I mean, growing up, I grew up in Boston, which is a great sports city. I loved all the Boston sports teams. I just not a fan of American sports anymore. So I think that's a hard question.
Yeah, no problem. So, is there any? I mean, do you keep? I mean, I'm presume you would kind of keep up to date with different kind of trends and kind of things that's going on within the industry. But do you also keep eyes on the other sports in terms of do you take things that you see maybe in a basketball, a report that you've seen that you could apply to football? Like, do you keep tabs on different sports and do you bring ideas from different places?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, in the early days of football analytics, I think people were trying to kind of copy things too much, like one for one.
Mm,
The sports are just so different that you really can't do that. But I think there is definitely like some inspiration that you can take, and like just talking to people in baseball. I mean, seeing how many resources they have, it's like, well, that's one thing we should
yeah.
definitely bring into to football. But I think, the level of investment they have in infrastructure
Mm,
is quite inspirational. Or, how do they handle aging curves is something that maybe translates quite easily across sports. Whereas, how do you handle, international transfers or league transitions? There's not really a sport in the world that kind of has to deal with it the way that our football does. So I think you have to kind of like pick and choose um, where you find that inspiration. And the irony is my going back to the Markov chains paper, but that was actually inspired by an American football paper written by somebody named Keith Goldner.
mm.
So yeah, I'm a big believer that like there are very few like truly original ideas, and a lot of it is taking inspiration from other locations and just figuring out the right way to apply everything.
Yeah, cool. So you mentioned your husband there, Ravi. So Ravi, obviously well known as well within sports analytics. He was at Seattle Sounders, was it? Was he Seattle for a long time?
Correct.
So,
Yeah.
and you mentioned he is also co-founder of Source, the consultancy that you're kind of with now, Sarah. So I've got the website up. I'm just gonna kind of read this line from the website. So Source works with a range of key stakeholders inside football organisations, from scouts, analysts, and coaches to investors and ownership groups, and it kind of breaks down the different things that you do, Sarah. So obviously we can't kind of go into every one there, but in terms of one, I just want to pick from the website. It says Academy Operations and Youth Play Development. So are you able to just kind of talk a little bit around maybe what you do in terms of that regard, in terms of the youth setups in different teams?
Yeah, I mean, so this is kind of inspired by some of the work we did at Arsenal. So owning your own data collection process at the time allowed you to collect data on the academy that was the same spec as the first team. And so what we could do is we could kind of backfill and say like, all right, we're going to collect data on all the different age groups going back a number of years. We know where these players have ended up, or we think we know where they're going to end up.
Mm,
Um, and then you can kind of like benchmark, and you can say like, where does this player compare to an Alex Iwobi? Where does this player compare to Chuba Akpom? Where does this player compare to? I guess we didn't go back as far as Jack Wilshere, but
yeah,
you get the drift. Where there's different levels of players that have gone through the academy, and so you could kind of like benchmark. And I think where we were really successful at Arsenal is one, doing that benchmarking, but two, really working with kind of the staff at that age level. So it was always head coach, assistant coach, performance analyst, to kind of help develop these individual development programs. So this is nothing groundbreaking. Loads of academies do this. But where we were unique was just kind of adding that kind of data-driven lens to it because, there's loads of players, people get ideas in their head about what a player is good or bad at. And so we would kind of have this objective, and I say objective in quotes because like the data isn't truly objective.
Yeah.
But we would help them come up with an IDP that maybe helped combat some of their biases.
Yeah.
And so I think this was really good, and it made our product better as well because there were loads of things they were seeing that weren't necessarily being captured in the data yet. So it was really great working with the staff and helping them with that. And so now, fast forward, let's say 5-10 years, there are data companies that are saying, okay, you give us the video, we're going to tag your academy matches in the same spec
Yeah.
as the first team. And so this is allowing us to do kind of similar models to what we were doing at Arsenal with different academies. Now, some of the challenges are not every academy in the world is going to have the same number of human beings working at every age group. And so that's like an interesting challenge. But yeah, I mean, that's kind of the idea about it. And, the downside is Arsenal, we just had so much historical data, whereas for a lot of these academies, like let's talk about maybe like an MLS academy, they haven't had the same number of players coming through to get to the first team level. And, the way that the US ecosystem is, it's not like, oh, if they don't make it to first team, they're going to end up here or they're going to end up here. There's so many options for a player's career coming out of the Arsenal Academy versus an MLS Academy where it's MLS, USL,
Yeah.
go get a day job, basically.
Yeah.
So that's one of the difficulties of it. But yeah, that's kind of the gist of what we're trying to help
Yeah.
clubs do.
Cool. So I'm going to ask you about the kind of the future then, in terms of the future of football analytics. And Sarah, if you had a crystal ball, what do you see coming in the future? What maybe would you like to see? What excites you? Kind of just to gauge where what you're thinking in terms of the years to come.
Yeah, I mean, I'm excited because the kids we see coming into the industry these days, they're really smart. They've been thinking about football data their whole lives.
Mm.
Whereas for me, it was like, oh, didn't even start thinking about this until, well into my 20s. So yeah, I mean, the future is bright in terms of like raw talent. But I think, where things go is like making sure that they're working on interesting problems. I think one of the difficulties right now with football clubs is that in order to kind of get up and running, there's so much kind of not necessarily like boring work, but everybody has to solve the same types of problems in order to get started. And so hopefully, companies like mine or companies similar to mine are helping clubs kind of like avoid that, where it's like, we'll provide you with a foundation and you can go hire smart kids and really kick on from there. But yeah, I mean, I think, this is the first time where I feel like it's really easy to find smart, talented people, like really high level people, which is good. At the same time, Skill Corner has been around for a number of years, and I've mentioned their name a number of times, but um, you know, within the relatively long history of football analytics, this is the first time that people really have access to tracking data,
Yeah.
not just in their own league, but now you can use it for recruitment. So I think that's a really, really exciting development for us. And, again, kind of the sad reality is that a lot of clubs just don't have the time and resources to really maximize it. So, what Skill Corner is doing in terms of providing kind of models on top of the raw data is really good. And I think we're going to see more and more companies doing things like that. I know there's a company out there, Respo Vision, they're doing kind of pose estimation, which
Mm.
is kind of like the next frontier, and everybody gets excited about it. But if people don't have time for like 2D stuff, they certainly don't have time for 3D stuff. So I think there it's, again, kind of trying to build models on top of that for their customers so that it's easier for them to consume. And yeah, I mean, then like there's the existential crisis of the club where it's like, well, if we're just using the same models as everybody else that we're getting from a third party. Like, where's our competitive advantage?
Yeah.
And I still think in football, like there's so much competitive advantage in having a sound decision making process. And I think that's really going to improve with kind of as the role or I guess as the profile of sporting director changes. We are starting to see kind of like younger, more modern sporting directors come into kind of pretty prominent roles. And so they're going to be really heavily focused on optimal decision making processes, not just like going with my gut.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
so,
Definitely.
so I think that's just going to be good things for the industry.
Yeah, sure. That you did say, obviously you mentioned Skill Corner and the tracking data. I'm recording a podcast in the next couple of weeks around that particular topic, so I'm looking forward to that and learning more about that myself. So yeah, I'm cautious of time, so I just want to ask you more. I like to ask for advice basically from all the guests. So for someone that is looking to get started in sports analytics, and I suppose this kind of can be broken down in terms of two things. So tips to get started from a total kind of novice at this stage, but also tips for people that are maybe working at a high-ish level within analytics, but outside of football, and they want to break in. So can you kind of talk around them if possible, Sarah?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's loads of resources now. Like the most obvious one would be Friends of Tracking.
Mm.
But like just, go and kind of spend a couple months just learning about what's being done. And do it in a way that like be skeptical. Like just because that's how it's being done doesn't mean it's necessarily like the
Yeah,
best way. And I think that's something that we really value in my company is people kind of questioning like, well, why are we doing it this way? And certainly like for me, like working at a single club for close to a decade, like we get very set in our ways. So I appreciate people coming to me and being like, well, why are we doing it this way? It's like, well,
yeah,
I don't know. That's what I thought of 10 years ago. Like maybe there's a better way of doing this.
yeah,
So yeah, so I really appreciate that. So, I would say definitely look at what's being done, be skeptical, and then the next step is kind of try to replicate what's been done and take your skepticism, try to implement it, and try to understand, well, why did they choose that? Is there a better way? Um, since I got my start kind of blogging and entering research competitions, I'm always a big fan of that. So certainly if you're kind of somebody working at a high level in analytics, once they break into football, by all means, get your hands dirty on some data and really show what can be done. Because I think there's definitely like a level of kind of academic rigor missing in a lot of things. And part of that is just like we have to be practical. We only have 38 matches.
yeah.
So there are some kind of liberties that you have to take sometimes because you can't just always go to the sporting director and say, inconclusive, sorry, like can't tell you. Um, but yeah, I mean, I think the industry just as a whole has kind of like used that as an excuse to just be like, yeah, we can do whatever we want with the numbers. So
Yeah.
there's definitely, yeah, some space for, I guess, more technical rigor.
Awesome. And any advice on kind of the interview process? You mentioned that back at Microsoft. I'm sure you've kind of hired people and you may still look to hire people at Source moving forward. So any advice on that kind of situation?
Yeah, I mean, so hiring is really hard, even for a company like mine, where we're not affiliated with any football clubs. We're just an independent football company. We get like 700 to 1,000 applications for every job that we've posted, which is really hard to go through. But like, my company is nothing without the people that we hire. Like they're the ones that really make it happen. So we want to make sure that we're hiring the best person. So for me personally, I spend a lot of time thinking about, what are the skills that we want in this person? How can we measure them? How can we measure them fairly? And so every question that we ask, we have a reason for asking it. And then we know what a good answer looks like. We know what a poor answer looks like. And we know what a great answer looks like. And we try to keep things as consistent as possible across all the candidates to make it as fair as possible because, some people you might click with a little bit more than others if you're just having kind of like a free flowing
Yeah.
conversation. That doesn't mean they're necessarily going to be like the best data engineer or the best data scientist. So, to me, it all comes down to knowing what you're looking for, trying to figure out how to measure it because it's not always easy. And then, yeah, being really strict about kind of like evaluating what good looks like. And yeah, I think that gets you pretty far. But it's certainly not easy. I mean, um, how do you measure ability to learn quickly?
Yeah, yeah,
I have no idea. But that's something that we value quite a bit.
yeah, yeah. Okay, perfect. Last question, Sarah. I do always ask to every guest. I don't know if you are a big reader or anything, but do you have any recommendation or any books, any podcasts? Doesn't have to be football analytics related. Anything that you want to give a shout out to that you've enjoyed recently?
Yeah, so I've gotten really into audiobooks lately. So I highly recommend audiobooks to people because you can just listen to them like doing anything. So it's like a cheat code for getting, yeah, just more information in your brain. So right now I'm listening to Killing the Unicorn by Emma Hayes, which
Mhm.
is fantastic. It's kind of just like a general kind of like management book, but what really strikes me is that it's a football manager
Yeah,
talking about like managing people, which I think not enough football managers talk about. So I'm really enjoying that at the moment. I just finished Data Feminism, which was a really interesting book that I think anybody who deals with data at all should really read because it talks a lot about, yeah, questioning how is this data being generated, who's collecting it, for what purposes, because that has loads of implications around bias. And so certainly dealing with sport, anybody who's kind of like thinking about getting into women's football, there's a lot of questions to be asked there as well. And then I think the last book that I've really enjoyed recently is called Thinking in Bets by Annie Duke. And so, yeah, it's just a lot around how to make better decisions. And, she has a background as a professional poker player.
yeah,
And so certainly, there's loads of people who've been successful in sports with similar backgrounds to that. But, I really liked her concept of having this group of people that she reviewed decisions with. And they don't talk about outcomes. They just talk about the process getting there. And yeah, I just don't see enough football clubs kind of retrospectively talking about decisions they made
yeah.
independent of the outcome. So those would be my three recommendations.
Perfect. Well, I'll link all them down below. I'll also link you down below in terms of your Twitter and stuff like that, and your LinkedIn, Sarah. So again, thanks very much for your time. Really appreciate you answering the questions. I hope people kind of take some value from this, and I'll mention throughout the conversation. I'll link a few bits and pieces that we spoke about down below the video. But that's everything from me, Sarah. Anything else you want to give a shout out to before we wrap it up?
No, this has been wonderful. Thanks so much for having me on.
Amazing. Thanks. Have a great day, Sarah, and I'll catch you soon.
All right, take care. Bye.